So we'll switch now to English today, but thank you for the opportunity of letting me talk, and thank you for coming here. And today I talk about facts that occurred 15 years ago, or most precisely, I think it was 17 years ago, when I was conducting ethnographic fieldwork and immersion among Bosníu-Róma families who lived in an informal shanty. This is a picture of the shanty where I stayed in the periphery of Rome in Italy. And I'm still conducting research with Rome and also with this network of families. But I can openly talk about these facts now, finally, after having them for a long time here in the stomach, but without having the possibility of talking about this, because this is a place that exists no more. People, the protagonists of this paper are spread out in Germany and other places in Europe. So basically, by reflecting and talking about this thing which doesn't exist any longer, I'm no longer afraid that my words might cause damage to somebody. And also, probably is also that I reached new understandings in the arch of my research, and also an emotional detachment from those events. And this allows me also to see things more clearly and also to have the courage to expose myself, because we scholars have difficulties in exposing to our mistakes. And I will draw a connection between whiteness, gender, politics, and ethnographic fieldwork. And I propose to reflect on my positionality as ethnographer vis-à-vis the multiple forms of violence, of everyday violence and institutional violence that I witnessed during my fieldwork among Bosnian-Roma and Rome. And violence that's mutatis mutanda I can still witness today in my research with the Roma in Italy. And the multifaceted and ambiguous and almost ungraspable quality of violence has captured anthropologists' attention for decades. Hughes and Bourgeois, they wrote that violence is a slippery concept that defies easy categorizations, and it can be everything and nothing. And here I'm quoting: legitimate or illegitimate, visible or invisible, necessary or useless, senseless and gratuitous, or utterly rational and strategic. And I end the quote. So researchers addressed violence revolving around out of the ordinary events like wars, ethnic conflicts, revolutions, but also they explore different intersecting forms of violence which occur in everyday life, from the structural violence enacted by states, bureaucracies, multinational corporations, to the violence that is scourging the existence of urban underprivileged, like those I'm going to talk about, and that lures also into the domestic walls. Therefore, it is no surprise that anthropologists and ethnographers often witness violence in their fieldwork. And at times we experience it prima mano. And the encounter with violence poses a double challenge as humans and as scholars. As human beings, we have to emotionally handle violence and make sense of it within our life. As scholars, we have to face the task of making sense of it in our accounts and in our analysis. And the risk, again, I build on Hughes and Bourgeois, the risk is misrecognizing the extent to which structural inequalities and power relations are naturalized by our categories and conceptions of what violence really is. And that's why we have to question hegemonic definitions of what violence is and what violence is not. And we have to frame violence at the intersections of domestic, local, national, transnational frameworks and processes of exploitation, oppressions, and resistance. So I want to first introduce you the ethnographic context in its spatial, political, and temporal dimensions. The fieldwork took place in Rome, which is probably the Italian city which has the most virulent, violent, and manifest explicit forms of violence against the Roma. There is a deeply ingrained and aggressive mechanism of dehumanization and criminalization that targets any person identified as Gypsy or Roma. And it is diffused around the whole political spectrum, from the far right to the left. It is pervading media discourses and also grassroots imageries. And Roma are considered as a homogeneous group, or sometimes race, and basically a race or group of criminals, idols, vagrants. So this reminds a lot Foucault's ideas of the dangerous classes, no? Whose civilization, morality, and humanity is often questioned. They are not completely as humans as us. They are not civilized, and they don't have morality, or they lack it. So they are practically irrelevant because the population of Rome is pretty low, but symbolically they are a cumbersome presence because their tradition, lifestyle, social organization, work ethics, their indomitable resilience and strive for self-determination are, in the eyes of the bureaucratic nation state, a threat to morality and order. And that's why the Roma are object of institutional ghettoization in so-called nomad camps. You have some examples of these nomad camps here, but also repression, neglect, discrimination. And then they are also object of everyday racism, discrimination, microaggressions, violent attacks, despite. And with other figures of otherness, they are the perfect scapegoats of the structural inequalities which are growing in Italian society. But I want to underline also one thing which is very important, which is that anti-Gypsyism is pervading Italian society, but it is not the only face that the eternal city is offering to its Romani population, because the local rootedness of the families that have been known for 25 years and more testifies to forms of solidarity, of vicinity with the local population and even with the authorities in a strange way. So we have complicated landscapes, okay, of that can be captured by a Seo sentence, which is this: an individual integration despite the collective rejection of the Gypsies, which is probably something that we can see also here in Iceland when you have people who are very concerned about the presence of migrants, which they feel as a threat, or I don't know, border people are terrorists, but then they have very good friends among migrants and foreigners. So racism doesn't always translate in systematic racism, okay, by the people. Now, my fieldwork for doctoral studies took place during a peak of anti-Gypsyism and xenophobia, which was 2007, when Romania was finally accessing the EU, and there were these talks about this sudden invasion of Roma to the eternal city, to Rome, and the city authorities declared a security emergency, which was allegedly triggered by this invasion of Romanian Roma. And I spent 4 months, because it was the beginning of my fieldwork, I spent 4 months of ethnographic immersion among Romanian and Bosnian Roma who dwelled in illegal settlements, and practiced forms of informal, and in this kind was formal and informal working occupations. They were begging in the streets. They were conducting all kinds of streets, black market, black labor in building sites, scrap metal collection. Often, most of the time, it was not authorized. Petty theft. We call it arrangiarsi, okay? Try to navigate the difficulties of everyday life. And the settlement was a cluster of tents and shacks spread on the riverbanks, which were adjacent to the highly populated district of Magliana. So it was a stretch of land here with cane breaks, and there was nothing. There was no water, no electricity. So life was difficult. Proximity to urban space and the temporary tolerance of the local authorities had made the riverbanks a feasible dwelling space, which gradually attracted other Roma which were evicted from other settlements in the area. In that time, I saw that only in that area there had been 30 evictions of Roma settlements. So this was growing, the population, but the living conditions were extremely harsh, as I was saying, due to the lack of infrastructures, including water and electricity, the exposition to the weather, and the constant threat of an eviction. And as my fieldwork unfolded, I realized that violence was ingrained in the everyday life of the Roma, which I spent my days with. Many non-Roma local residents, they looked at with scorn at the gypsy presence, at the gypsy shanty, and the gypsies traversing the district and scavenging in the rubbish, filling water tanks at the public fountains, buying food at the local markets, begging at the entrance of supermarkets, attending the bars, the few ones which still accepted the presence of the gypsies inside. And I use the term gypsy because it is demeaning, and this is how these people were categorized and identified with a stereotype. And the diffuse grassroots intolerance reflected and contributed to the poisoned political debate, further pushing local authorities to adopt repressive approaches, and these included police raids in Roma dwellings, street controls based on ethnic profiling, arrest of undocumented Roma, systematic eviction of their settlements. But the authorities' repertoire also included informal governing practices. Maybe this is just Italy, but some of these informal practices appeared to be also well-intended. They consisted, for example, in tolerance of unauthorized settlements. They were illegal, but they were still there. And sometimes there were agreements between the inhabitants and the police concerning, for instance, the assurance that the settlement would not grow in dimension. That was now the big scary thing for for the authorities and the local population, getting a big gypsy settlement in the backyard. And these reciprocal agreements, they saved the authorities time, money, and paperwork. But they also spared the Roma consequences of a strict application of the law. And this suited especially my Bosnian Roma friends, because none of them had a visa, many were completely undocumented, and so they navigated this kind of form of housing and working informality. There was, however, a darker and disturbing phase of informal practices, which was the indiscriminate use of police harassment and brutality. And the specter of beatings of male Roma, especially the destruction of shacks, torments perpetrated by police officers, especially those who were not clad with the uniform, it creeped into the everyday life of the inhabitants of informal settlements. And these repressive formal and informal practices served pragmatically to create an institutional display of power that was meant to reassure the citizens, but also to make life unbearable to the Roma. And so I encountered officers who were also even sympathetic with what they called the poor devils, the poveri diavoli. They manifested unease towards repressive and violent police acts. But it is on the diffuse forms instead of police street violence, which was the main thing there, it was much more common, that I want to focus here. Now, in the study of the police violence in Rio de Janeiro, Salem and Larkins argue, and I quote, that the exercise of sovereignty by the police was a male prerogative reserved to the European colonizer and achieved through forms of violent masculinity. And now this concept is defined as the, and I quote again, the reconfiguration of the relation between what they call the wild masculinity and composed masculinity. Now, wild masculinity is a masculine performance of wild power, they say, that is a power that is unregulated, unofficial, unpredictable, potentially annihilating exercise of male violence. The latter, instead, is an institutionalized and legally codified expression of violence and of masculinity, wherein male violence is more composed, but not necessarily not less intense. And what I could observe in my field work was not so dissimilar from what Salem and Larkins describe. Officers patrolling the settlement were exclusively white Italian males who generally looked at the Roma as dirty scum and petty criminals. Their performances followed variable combinations of wild and composed masculinity, where implicit and explicit physical and psychological forms of violence were modulated according to the interlocutor, the context, and the purpose of the interactions. And aside some beatings and physical aggressions, police officers often perpetrated microaggressions. That is, as Smith-Oka writes, subtle insults and demeaning behavior that reflect and enforce the perpetrator's perception of their superiority. And the episodes of violence had more or less the same script. Once entered the settlements, officers would drive by with their patrol cars, drive by tents and caravans with intimidating gazes. Sometimes they would be countered with a slow, menacing drive-through. Other times, randomly, and randomness was a strategy to instigate insecurity of the unpredictability of violence. They would stop and they would start questioning person and blend aggressive attitudes with compassionate ones, because they were highlighting that I'm closing an eye on what you are doing. I know what you're doing, which was, you're in illegality, but I'm closing the eye. But I might decide not to close it. So there was a threat, a continuous threat. And these performances carried out under the curious and concerned gaze of the Roma bystanders, who seldom intervened, of course, they often targeted male Roma. And the display of masculine power performed by officers, it was performed through rough questioning, suspicions, allegations, more or less explicit racist comments, aggressive body language, the intrusion also into the domestic space of a caravan and a tent, which is violent per se, right? So if you see police just storming into your house, this is violent. And it seemed aimed somehow, this was the feeling, it seemed aimed at taming the wild savages, so the gypsies, in their natural environment, which was the nomad camp. So by targeting the gypsy man, the figure that officers identified as the detainer of traditional authority in the Roma society, the officers seemed also to target the very heart of the gypsy social organization. By undermining masculine domestic authority in front of the Roma families and the community, the officers imposed a public transcript of interethnic domination, which methodically undermined, or this is what they tried to do, undermined the allegedly subversive and dangerous self-determination of the Roma. Therefore, when this kind of violent performances became continuous, whenever the patrol car was spotted approaching the settlements, the men would just disappear in the campbreaks. They would hide and then would maybe do a long round, arrive to and then get into the neighborhoods to escape the violence of the encounters. They disappeared, and this spared the practical and symbolic repercussions of the encounter with the police, but it left the Roma women, the Romnia, to deal with that, with the burden and responsibility and the risks which are inherent to dealing with the police intruding into the domestic space. And the Romnia were in a difficult situation. Now, just to be sure, yes. Now, we have a difference between the police exhibition of masculinity with the men and with the women. Because towards women, so towards the Romnia, especially when the husbands were away, the interactions between Roma and Gypsies was different. Because the Roma women were often treated as uncanny deviants, perpetrators of an immoral gypsy culture on their children. But they were also considered as target. They were target of a romanticizing and exoticizing imagery, which is very widespread in Italian society, which depicts gypsy women as victims of gypsy patriarchal society, their freedom and wild sexuality suffocated by their allegedly neglecting authoritarian and violent husbands, brothers, and fathers. So my point is that the Romnia were facing the same violent masculinity that targeted their men, their husbands, brothers, sons. But in this case, this wild masculinity translated into a blend of despise, repulsion, respect, piety, and attraction. Ironically, so, the officer's imagery was corroborated by the men's escape. You see, they go away, no? And they leave the women deal with that. But there was also the Romnia tactical self-representation, which corroborated this imagery, because the Romnia, they did not hesitate to leverage on stereotypical images of the neglected gypsy woman to inspire empathy, thereby reawakening the colonial trope of white men saving brown women from the brown men. Okay? And this is something that often gets completely unnoticed by many social workers and scholars as well. So these complex scenarios trap the Romnia into a struggle between competing masculinities, the officers' masculinities and their husbands' masculinities. And in this confrontation, the Roma men, they felt humiliated every time they tactically left their wives handling the encounter with the law. The Romnia, on their part, they lamented paying the toll of a situation in which their husbands took the easy way out. But they also saw the inevitability of the situation and reproached police tormenting their husbands in front of their children. These were arrogant attacks on Roma society as a whole. And finally, they were used to handle relations with the police officers alone, because this was part of the daily routine while working in the center. And besides, not having their husbands around gave the Romnia a free hand for tactical self-representation and interactions that they would not enact otherwise. So this complexity appears in an episode. I hope you can read it. These are from the field, from my field notes, and I'm using all pseudonyms. And it was in September afternoon, after weeks of growing tensions, where for the whole summer, there was a constant flow of Roma evicted from other settlements. So the settlement on the riverbanks is swelling, raising concerns among the Roma population, and the increased frequency of the police raids worried the inhabitants, which they saw this as a sign of an incoming eviction. But there were regular patrols on the settlements also for another situation, which was kind of contradiction and paradoxical, and it was the fact that there was a Romni who was at home arrest, house arrest, or home detention in the informal settlement. And we might see how contradictory, but how interesting this tangle of informality is. But the point was that there was a carabinieri. Carabinieri is an army, but with police duties. We have a lot of these police corps in Italy. And the carabinieri, they had the duty of surveilling that this woman that I will call Sulta, she had four kids, and she was 20 years old, strong, extremely strong woman. And they had the duty of controlling that she was not breaking the house arrest and the home detention. And so they would regularly arrive to the settlement and see, and there were a lot of interactions. And so what happened is that there was a man who I will call Franco, who was Sulta's referent and appointed to the duty of control. And in few weeks, also to the fact that Sulta's husband was often away, also getting out of the settlement when the police was arriving, what happened was that the formality of bureaucratic roles had given way to more informal modalities of interactions between Franco and Sulta. And both of them, they welcomed and nurtured these kind of informal practices for pragmatic purposes, because Franco, according to Sulta, hoped to get an entry point into the district underworld, okay, to get a kind of informer. Sulta, in turn, she used Franco to sense the pulse of the authorities, to understand what was going on, what they were thinking in terms of eviction, in terms of repression, what did they know about the underworld. And she hoped also to get Franco as a possible resource for her family, who lacked any kind of juridical capital. This was a relational capital which she could spend. So it was this kind of informal reciprocal use. And during these patrols, I had sometimes seen their interaction, but always at distance, and blending in with other inhabitants of the settlements. Because usually if the police saw me and understood that I was not a Rom, they started to immediately consider me as a party in crime. And I was immediately defined as a criminal. Because surely the Roma had an illegal activity, and surely I was there because I was making money in that way. And so that afternoon, most of the inhabitants of the riverbanks were carrying out their course. The carabinieri appear, and many go away, and I remain seated with two young Romnia. I was the only adult male. I mean, I was adult. Yeah, I was 30 years old, and I was the only one sitting close to these two females. And in the slide, you can read the whole interaction, and I will probably go also further. But basically, Franco's behavior revolved around forms of microaggression directed almost methodically at the two Romnia and at me. And I was the only adult male among two young gypsy women, and Franco's performance of masculinity challenged mine with the meaning attitudes. Now, didn't you have the circular stamps at the university and so on? But he was somehow also intertwining his attitudes with veiled threats revolving around my potential involvement in illegal activities. And Sulta, paradoxically, is safe because of the house arrest and the home detention. She was the only one who could be there legally in an illegal settlement. She maintained a challenging attitude which somehow followed a familiar script of mutual teasing between Franco and Sulta. And then there was Anifa, who was married with Sulta's husband, who became target of Franco's attention. There were flirtations, sexual insinuations. He provocatively asked her out, insisting on taking her on a romantic date in the city center with a follow-up in his place. And Hanifa, to me, seemed trying to make the best out of a bad job. And I remember feeling the urge to react against a performance of masculinity that seemed based on one of the governing themes that McClintock identifies as constituting Western imperialism, which is, and I quote, the transmission of white male power through the control of colonized women. And as ethnographer who cared for his interlocutors, and who positioned himself at the far left of the political spectrum, I wanted to protest against the racist insinuation of sexual availability of my two Roma friends. And I also wonder today how much my identity as a white male, Italian, tickled me the idea of playing with words, saving the brown women from the white men, the police. But what disturbed me most was how Franco used the power of the uniform to provoke us, to keep us on the griddle, leveraging on the common awareness of the various forms of illegality taking place on the riverbank. And I was afraid that voicing my critique might put the Roma in further precarious situation. But I also was worried about personal stuff. My wife and our 6-month-old daughter, who were at home, what would happen if I were to face an arrest or problems with the law? Who would take care of them? So despite my moral compass and my hurt masculinity, I accepted the public transcript of domination. And out of fear, as much as out of wisdom, I instinctively chose to trust the Romnia, to trust their experience in this kind of street politics, hoping that they knew their way out of the situation. And that proved to be actually a successful, where is it? Yes. It proved to be a successful choice, but I also made 2 mistakes. One at the level of interpretation, and the other one on the practical level, and they are connected. So with the departure of the Carabinieri, I finally felt that I could vent out my frustration from an encounter which I found troubling and vilifying and demeaning for all of us. To my surprise, the Romnia seemed instead completely untouched by Franco's insolence. So I grew confused by recalling that Anifa had been quite aggressive when reacting in similar circumstances in which a Gaggio, and so a non-Rom, had indirectly questioned her fidelity and the solidity of her marriage. And this person had encountered the temper of Anifa. She was an aggressive woman when she wanted, but not in this case. And so the contrast between those reactions that I've seen and the reaction that I saw with the police officer, it somehow confirmed me that she was being remissive and keeping a subaltern position in that circumstance because she was trapped. This was my interpretation. Now today, after 15 years and more, I know that the Romnia, they were not passive at all. They were not passively accepting Franco's behavior. What I experienced as an abuse of power on 2 subaltern Roma women had been, in the eyes of the Romnia, quite a successful interaction. And this is why neither of them had felt the urge, like me, to regurgitate a hidden transcript of indignation. So I was the only one touched. They were like, it's okay. Because they had not been choking back, like me, the responses that they would have been imprudent to pronounce against police violence, blah, 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 blah. Because there was no situation of subalternity in their eyes. On the contrary, they had displayed their power. They even mocked the officers without them noticing it. They even convinced the officers of the exact contrary, that they were in a subaltern position. In the eyes of the two Romnia, they had tricked Franco into playing their game. And they had just proved how smooth it was to manipulate the Gaggé, which are clad in the state uniform. They were just leveraging on the Italian collective imagery that endows young gypsy women with seducing power. And they were using this. Proof of this were in their eyes the repeated delusional flirtations through clumsy sentences in Slavic, which Franco had been doing, the greasy comments, the ridiculous invitation for a romantic evening in the center, because the center is the place where the Romnia went to work. So it is your working place. You don't go to have fun in the center. So for them, this was completely just, this is the stupidity, the dilipé of the gadget. So Sultan Hanif had been outlining Franco's vulnerability and gullibility. Also because he had blurted out useful information about the oncoming eviction. And so he confirmed his potential as a social capital, giving information which could be precious. Because in an eviction, if you know the eviction and you don't have documents, you go the day before, so that you will not be found out when the eviction occurs. So these were all very precious information that they were getting. So the Turomnia had been domesticating the gadget, and had been domesticating Franco. And metonymically, by showing his vulnerability, they were showing the vulnerability of the bureaucratic state power that he represented. The same power that was threatening them with evictions, detention, expulsion, and repression. Now, who had the truth of it? The Roma or the gadget interpretation remains an open question. Each perspective enlightened and deconstructed and so questionable character of the other. But if politics is a practice of world-making, then, which is carried out also through ordinary but symbolically heavy gestures, then that interaction had been part of a biopolitical work. The Romnia were opening to another possibility of looking at the world, the same world in which the gadget live, the powerful gadget live, and being in it. And like the Banouche, which is another Roma group described by Williams, by Patrick Williams, the Romnia were, I use Williams' term, civilizing the world. They were confirming how the world goes and the place that the Roma have in this world. A world where the gadget and their state can be powerful, and this power can affect the Roma, but does not determine the Roma, does not undermine the self-determination, it doesn't force them into a condition of helpless subalternity. The integrity and totality of the process of this redefinition of the world, which is a cosmological operation, where you put who has the which role has in the existence, in the functioning of the world and of the cosmos. So this integrity and totality of this process, Williams explained, doesn't need any recognition from the gadget in order to be true for the Roma, but it needs a constant, continuous renew and confirmation. And that afternoon, my outburst against Franco-violence masculinity, which I saw as vehicle and symbol, expression of the anti-gypsy violence of the bureaucratic state, my outburst attracted the attention of two teenagers, Roma, who had seen the scene at a distance from the caravan. Of course, they did not intervene. But then they came to me and said, what were you saying? What did Hanifa do? And so they started questioning Hanifa. And this is the other mistake that I did, They questioned Hanifa over her response to Franco's advance. And building on my interpretation of the event, they eventually accused Hanifa of her submissive and almost complacent attitude. She was accepting flirt because she had not been denying it aggressively as she had done in other situations. And I tried to defend Hanifa by arguing that she could hardly do otherwise, because Franco had the power of the uniform. What do you do in front of a police who is threatening you? This was my explanation, which was instead not working well and creating even more problems, as I will show. So by bringing my indignation to surface, by giving it life through the bare utterance of my interpretation, the Roma interpretation of the encounter appeared suddenly exposed to a possible disclaim. Maybe the gadget was right. And somehow it was as if my words had broken the integrity of this process of civilizing the world. As if they had highlighted the fragility of the Roma interpretation and opened to the possibility of Sultan and Hanifa being two helpless women forced to the role of the mice rather than the cat. That is the cosmological vision of the Gagé, not of the Roma. And here is an example of the dangerous evoking power that the Roma assign to words. Saying things among the Roma has this power of creating, putting them into life. This is done, for example, of course, it's very easy to see talking about, for example, spirits and demons. You talk about them, you give the name, you use that name, and the spirit will come, will arise. So a similar thing is here when you use the words have power for the Roma to evoke things and to make things true and real. But it's also an example of my frivolous assumptions as ethnographer, because I wanted to confirm my allegiance, which I felt having betrayed with my silence on an abuse of power. I also felt the need to voice a hidden transcript of resistance, which I expected my interlocutors would welcome. Hey, I'm on your side. But ironically, I assumed to express vicinity with them. Look at this bastard policeman, blah, blah, blah. And instead, I was expressing my distance because I was just a Gajo who didn't understand how the world goes. I was just an ignorant Gajo who doesn't know. I was just whose way of thinking was resembling the stereotypical idea that the Roma are needy subjects in need of a patronizing support from the non-Roma. And today I suspect that Sultan's exhortation to leave before that interaction started had been grounded exactly on knowing that I didn't know. Ni Janel, the Roma said. I was just a Gaje who doesn't know how the world goes. And I'm reaching to the conclusion. So I was stuck in this way of seeing how the world goes, which is the way of seeing of the Gaje. Despite years of research and months of ethnographic immersion with the Roma. And I failed to notice the subversive process of mockery and domestications by the means of which two Romnia were protecting, and I paraphrase Hersfeld words, they were protecting their autonomy and their moral worlds. By voicing my interpretation of the events, I had put a question mark on this work. But assigning too much power to the words I pronounced after the afternoon would mean, again, to think too much as a Gajo. So sorry, but I'm going more and more into this kind of ambiguity. To say with Williams, mine had been the words of a Gajo who was confusing reality with the image he had in his mind, in his head. The words that I had pronounced had only convinced two young Roma. And the young Roma, the kids, like Gaje, they don't know, ni Janen. Okay? It is renowned among Roma that the kids, they don't know everything like the Gaje. So my words damaged rather my ego, my masculinity, my self-perception as a perceptive ethnographer who had the truth of it. Although fragile, the integrity of the Roma world was not broken that afternoon. No, it would be broken by the eviction that occurred a few weeks later, which the Roma saw as the unsuccessful, annoying, but unsuccessful attempt to control their life and to undermine their existence. But Hanifa paid a toll for this situation. That evening, she got into a quarrel with her husband, who had been promptly informed by the two teenagers about her allegedly improper behavior. I was not at the camp that evening. What the two teenagers told me the morning after that Helio had beaten his wife. Helio being Hanifa's husband. To me, at least, Hanifa didn't give too much weight on what she defined only 2 slaps, which she asserted would have been even legit if she had been actually flirted with a police officer. Rather, she complained about the two teenagers who had put their nose into things that did not concern them and had misled her husband. But she also complained about her husband leaving her to deal with the police and believing into the nephew's nonsense. Hanifa didn't mention Franco's attitude. She didn't mention my words and the role I assigned them in causing her trouble. Again, I was just a disoriented gajo who talked without knowing how the world goes. Nonetheless, my sense of guilt remained, blending with the difficulty of making sense of the various forms of violence which I had witnessed, which I felt were trapping my actions and my understanding, and which I had also unwillingly contributed to. So, today I tried to highlight how the human and scientific depth of the person that we owe to the persons who accept us into their lives, bring us into their homes, face our mistakes, and sometimes pay for them. But the spiral of witness that I had witnessed, or violence that I had witnessed, still troubles me after all these years. Because I'm run, when I was reflecting on this, by a dreadful epiphanic realization. And it is this, that the allegations that the Roma moved to Anifa, she had not behaved well, for the Roma meant giving her the responsibility that comes with a choice. A wrong choice, but still a choice, which instead I had denied her. So, accusing Anifa was not of not contrasting the gajo flirt, meant assigning her, and metonymically all the Roma, a responsibility of a choice. So they were saying, you choose that, you were not forced to. And this was highlighting that political agency, that power of self-determination, which I did not understand, and which the state continually opposes and fears. So what I fear is that the domestic violence on a Romney, consequence of my words, had served a collective purpose, which was helping the Roma community to reaffirm its presence in the world, to reestablish beyond doubt a cosmological order, that the violent masculinity of the officers and the bureaucratic state of which this violence is vehicle and symbol had put for a moment in crisis. What I know, and this is really the end, is that this event renewed a methodological skepticism towards immediate interpretation of events, acts, interactions, words which we collect in the field. It pushed me to see things differently, with different eyes, and also to learn, at least I hope, when it is better to keep my mouth shut. Thank you. It went much longer than I thought.
Thank you, Marco, but we still have 10 minutes left for questions from the audience. I understand you can take them in English or Icelandic?
Yep.
There must be some good questions out there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marco. I am wondering about this community. I mean, you're focusing on Bosnia-Herzegovina people, but
Yeah.
there are other ethnic groups coming in the same settlement.
Yes, yes.
I am wondering also how this, because these are huge communities and stratification.
Yes, yes, yes.
Successful ones and poorer ones. I'm just wondering.
Yeah. So in this case, Romania, Roma, and Bosnia, Roma, it was the beginning of their interactions, those years. Now they also established which is the good way to deal with interethnic relations. Interethnic meaning between Romanian Roma and Bosnian Roma. Okay, at the beginning they didn't trust themselves, they didn't trust each other. They said, they are blathering a strange Romani. I don't understand anything, I need to talk in Italian. And being the Romanian Roma, those who had been the protagonists and the alleged cause of the security emergency, which had destroyed the relations and the balance that the Bosnian Roma had found with the authorities and the Roman population in the decades that had been in Rome. All this was destroyed by the Romanian Roma. So the Bosnian Roma, they blamed the Romanian Roma for destroying Italy, for ruining it. And but at the same time, they were Roma. So it was a very ambivalent relation between them. And in the beginning, there were all sorts of exotic images between among of the Bosnian Roma towards the Romanian Roma and vice versa. The Bosnian Roma will always say, yeah, look at the Romanian Roma, the women, the Romanian women, oh, they are so beautiful. But they were also like the Gage with this sexual drive, which is uncontrollable. Okay, this is how the Roma see us Gage. We cannot control our sexual drive. And that's why we behave in these strange ways. So this created vicinity. There were also occasions of mixed, almost mixed attempts of marriages, which went terribly. But there was cooperation. They were living in the same settlement sometimes, but there was also a lot of competition, because they were the same niche in terms of economy, but also in terms of politics and in terms of relation with the authorities, which were the Roma and the Romanian, where the Bosnian and Romanian Roma were competing. And also space, because all at once the Roma didn't have, my Bosnian Roma, they had a lot of space which had been filled by this Romanian Roma. And therein also both the communities, the Bosnian community and the Romanian community, they were co-living in the same place, but almost as two independent units. They had different relations with the authorities. And while, for example, the Romanian Roma, they had an established, since Romania, way of dealing with the authorities by giving the chief, the head. This is the representative of the community that's going to talk to you. And this facilitated a lot the relations between the authorities and the Roma settlements and the communities. While the Roma, they don't care. They are such anarchic that they when the police was asking, or the authorities were asking for a responsible of the community, 80 persons would come with 5, 6, 7 different representatives. Well, instead, the Romanian Roma, they would arrive with one, and there were maybe 400. But this is also political agency. The Romanian Roma were accepting this kind of colonial mechanism, where you find the chief and you talk to the chief. U.S. colonial power, in this case, the Italian society. While instead, if you don't have somebody to talk to, it's very difficult to manage and to grasp. So this was political resistance of the Roma not to accept leadership. And there were, of course, the poorest and the less poor in these communities. In this case, for example, the Bosnian Roma, I'm talking about, these were the ones who had, in the settlements, they were more or less all in a difficult situation. Other families which I was following and I still follow, instead they had documents, they had a place in an authorized settlements, which is not safe from police violence, but at least there were not evictions, for example. And an eviction is always a very difficult experience. I don't know if I answered the question.
One question in the back.
Thank you very much, Marco. And this question actually has to do with race and stereotypes, because I believe that when we're having discourses on race, we can't alienate the concept of stereotypes and stereotypical beliefs. Now, I want to ask this question based on your methodology, which was more like immersion, immersing yourself in the environment. So I believe you had a lot of personal interactions with the Romanians.
Yes, also the.
Do you believe that these stereotypes about them are justified? Because, I mean, you gave instances of Hanifa's actions, feeling that she was rather manipulating Franco and all that. But do you believe, as a result of other interactions with other people, that these ideas that we have about the Romanians are actually justified or even they are true?
No, so stereotypes, Oakley said, stereotypes, there is always something, they are always attached to some things that really exist, but then we manipulate these things. And it is very difficult to see if something is true or not, but it is very easy to see the results and the impacts of stereotyping on people. Of course, we might say, for example, you see now we have a clear example of Roma who, they navigate informality, illegality, so they are deviants and criminals. It might be possible to, but this would be reductive because it would not take into account a history of institutional violence which brought this. Because if you don't have, if you don't have documents, if you don't have a visa, if you're object of discrimination only because of the skin or the eyes in a certain way, or citizenship or alleged citizenship or lack of citizenship, or the fact that you live in a shanty town, this creates discrimination. You don't get a job for that. Where do you live? In the settlement? Ciao, bye. I'm not going to give you this, to employ you. So when we take all this, we understand that things are very complicated. And of course, we can say, okay, we are talking with people which are navigating illegality, but why is that? Is it because of the culture is saying this, or are things a little bit more complex? So stereotypes are... and then there is the fact that the stereotypes are also used as tools, as I was saying, by the same people. And here is, I think, probably one of the conundrums of Romani politics. We have intellectuals and politicians and activists that say, no, we have to fight the prejudice, we have to fight stereotypes. And then we have other people who instead say, hey, I'm just using this, you are taking out my weapon. But is this the... Of course, if you think on the long term, which is the best solution? Using the stereotypes, but then you are going to reinforce them, and the stereotypes create even more discrimination, or fighting the stereotypes, trying to avoid discrimination. But these stereotypes are so rooted in imagery, at least in European imagery, that some say is impossible, like stereotypes about black people in Europe. Are we able to really deconstruct them or not? And this is the challenge that we have today.
Should we take one question and one short answer? Because
yes, sorry.
Already 1 o'clock.
Thank you. You mentioned kind of two types of violence, or it's the violence that comes from outside the group towards the group, and then you mentioned in the end
yes.
the violence within the group. And my personal experience as an anthropologist is that I'm much less comfortable with the violence within the group. Like it's easy to shout at the rooftop about the police violence, but how do you deal with, or have you dealt with in writing as an anthropologist?
I mean, anthropologists, we in the course of anthropology of violence with James, we let students read a lot of articles, because I don't think there is a solution. It is very circumstantial, and first of all, because what we find violent defining violence already is not so easy. Some things are easy to define as violent, but others, and most of the attitudes might be violent or not. And this is also a cultural thing. And however, the point is that we might then miss ourselves into relativism and accepting everything at the same time. And I found myself also, and I didn't know what to do. And sometimes you regret, and this you continue being hunted by this stuff sometimes. But do we have the rights? Is it also resourceful for us? It's also a question of pragmatism sometimes. And then are we really able to change something by stepping out and say, hey, but I think most of this stuff at the end, so we have to just find a way to digest it, and I think, and it is while trying to step out when we really find it is important. But we are also always punching down, because we are the white men.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you.
Að lokum langar að þakka fyrir kærlega fyrir þetta komuna. Ég hvet ykkur til að fylgjast með viðburðum á þjóðarspeglinum. Kíkið inn á þjóðarspegli.h.is. Þeir sem ekki fá tölvupóstaregluna geta skráð sig á póstlista. Það ýmislegt annað gagnlegt þarna og ég bara hlakka til að sjá okkur í næstu og þar næstu viku. Takk fyrir.
Takk.